Pastor Bob Joyce before checking out these videos, and a lot of people are saying how similar his voice is to that of Elvis Presley's.
For decades, Elvis Presley fans have chased one haunting possibility. What if the king never really died? At the center of that mystery is Bob Joyce, a preacher whose appearance and voice have fueled speculation that he could somehow be Elvis himself. But now, the rumor has reached a point where Bob Joyce can't handle it any longer, and reportedly took a DNA test to finally confront the Elvis rumors once and for all. And when the results emerged, they allegedly left everyone asking even more questions. The test nobody expected him to take. For most of his adult life, Robert Wayne Joyce answered the question exactly the same way. He would be standing near his piano in a modest church in Benton, Arkansas, and somebody would work up the courage to ask, and he would tell them calmly that he was himself and nobody else. That answer never landed the way he hoped, because the people who wanted to believe otherwise had already built a trapdoor underneath it. In their minds, a denial was precisely what a man in hiding would be forced to give. So after 14 years of the same cycle, the pastor made a decision that genuinely surprised the people who knew him best. He agreed to take a DNA test. The choice had nothing to do with curiosity, because he already knew who he was and where he came from. It came out of pure exhaustion. Every Sunday, he led gospel music from behind that piano, and every Sunday, somebody in the comments or somebody standing at the door treated his voice as evidence of a secret so enormous it bordered on the supernatural. He needed something colder and harder than language, something that could not be reinterpreted by a stranger with editing software. The arrangements were handled quietly, without announcements or fanfare. Samples were collected under controlled conditions, and the process was designed to establish a clear biological profile, and, wherever it was possible, to measure his genetic markers against publicly available Presley family reference data. To understand why a gospel pastor ever felt he needed laboratory science to prove his own name, you have to go back to 2011, when a quiet recording from that tiny Arkansas congregation slipped into the corners of the internet, where Elvis Presley fans still gather every night. The voice that started a storm. The man singing at the Arkansas congregation had a deep, warm baritone and a wide, trembling vibrato, and it stopped people cold in the middle of scrolling. There was something in the phrasing that felt impossibly familiar, something that reached into a memory most listeners had not touched in years. For Elvis Presley fans, the voice seemed to carry echoes of the legendary singer they had spent decades listening to. Within a few months, comparison videos began appearing online, laying Bob Joyce's performances of How Great Thou Art directly over Elvis Presley's gospel recordings from the 1970s. The similarities became the focus of endless discussions. To certain listeners, the effect was almost physical. People described chills, tears, and a strange refusal to accept what their own logic was telling them. The more they listened, the more convinced some became that the resemblance could not simply be coincidence. One of those listeners was longtime Elvis fan Tom Menel, who publicly declared that the resemblance had convinced him the man behind that piano was the king himself, living quietly under a borrowed name. That single conviction, repeated, shared, and repeated again, became the spark that lit everything. The theory began spreading through Facebook groups and early YouTube channels, where clips were reposted, analyzed, slowed down, and compared frame by frame. The story was pushed along by an especially convenient claim that Bob Joyce had simply materialized in Benton with no earlier public trail behind him. To believers, that apparent mystery seemed almost perfect. If Joyce had no recognizable history before appearing in Arkansas, they reasoned, perhaps there was another identity hidden underneath. But that trail existed, and it was never hidden. Church records would later show that Joyce's ministry began informally around 2010, with 7 or 8 people gathering in living rooms and small rented spaces. His history went back much further. Joyce had been ordained since the 25th of May, 1981, and had been married to his wife, Willina, since 1975. Those details were not buried in some secret archive. They were part of an ordinary life that could be traced by anyone willing to look. Yet the growing online story treated those facts not as evidence of a normal American life, but as inconvenient obstacles that needed explaining away. Every ordinary detail could be reinterpreted. Every missing piece became another reason for speculation. And every similarity between Joyce and Elvis seemed to carry more weight than the documented history sitting in plain sight. The first wave of attention brought curious visitors driving into Benton to sit in the pews. Some came simply because they wanted to hear the mysterious preacher for themselves. Others arrived hoping to catch a glimpse of the man they believed might secretly be Elvis Presley. Videos from his church circulated even further, introducing Joyce to an audience far beyond Arkansas. For people who had grown up with Elvis's music, seeing a man who looked and sounded remarkably familiar created an emotional reaction that facts alone could not easily erase. And that is what made the rumor so powerful. It was no longer just a strange internet theory. For some Elvis fans, it had become a mystery they desperately wanted solved. The question was no longer simply whether Bob Joyce sounded like Elvis. It was whether there was something deeper connecting the two men, and eventually, whether science could finally settle the question. It also brought something much heavier, a steady flood of private messages demanding that a working pastor confess to being a man who had been dead since 1977. A catalog of impossible evidence. Once the theory took root, the supporters stopped being an audience and became collectors, and what they gathered grew stranger and more specific with every passing month. They pointed to scars they swore matched exactly, one above the left eye supposedly connected to a childhood accident, another on the right hand tied to a karate incident from the middle of the 1970s. They passed around stories of an unnamed forensic dentist who had reportedly identified 7 matching traits. They cited a voice analyst whose reported match rate sat somewhere above 96%. And in some versions of the story, the number climbed even higher. Facial overlays spread across every platform, lining up jaw lines, smile lines, and the exact tilt of a head, frame by careful frame. Some creators built entire channels around it, producing dozens of videos treating the theory as not merely possible, but likely. What made all of this so persuasive was how professional it looked. These were not sloppy posts thrown together in a hurry. Many arrived as polished productions with dramatic narration, frequency graphs, and side-by-side analysis that carried the appearance of real science to viewers who had no reason to doubt it. If you have ever watched one of those videos late at night and felt your certainty wobble, you already understand exactly how effective they were. Sitting against all of that emotion was one stubborn, immovable number. Joyce's own church website listed his full name as Robert Wayne Joyce, born on the 19th of June, 1952. Elvis Presley had been born on the 8th of January, 1935. 17 years separated those two dates, and that gap sat in the open, while the theory only grew larger. The believers handled the problem the way believers usually do, by stacking new stories on top of the old one, whispering about plastic surgery, about secret aging techniques, and about the possibility that the man preaching in Benton was only a decoy, while the real Elvis remained hidden somewhere far away. The rumor had become flexible enough to survive anything, and that flexibility was about to attract people with far uglier intentions. As the theory swelled, something darker attached itself to it, and this is the part of the story that genuinely wounded that small congregation. Fake accounts began appearing across social media, using Joyce's name and his photographs, reaching out to trusting fans with warm, friendly messages. In a number of cases, those accounts eventually asked those fans for money. The church responded in the only way it could, issuing repeated warnings, that the single authentic Facebook presence belonged to the account ending in Bob.Joyce.75, and urging anybody who received a strange message to walk away from it immediately. The website carried those warnings for years. The bitter irony of the whole situation is difficult to overstate. Joyce took no salary from the church at all. The congregation did not even pass a traditional offering plate during services. Instead, a simple box was fixed to the wall for free will giving, and the money that went in covered operations and maintenance rather than lining anybody's pockets. A man who had built his entire ministry around refusing payment was now watching con artists use his likeness to separate his admirers from their savings. The pressure inside that small church in Benton grew heavier with every passing season, and Joyce began to understand that his silence was no longer neutral. Staying quiet had started to cause harm of its own, and so he finally sat down and put everything in writing. The words he finally chose to speak. In 2016, he released a written statement that still stands as the clearest record of where he actually stood. He did not hide behind vague language or leave himself convenient wiggle room. He acknowledged the videos and the Facebook pages directly, admitted that he had personally contacted their creators and asked them to stop, and explained that he had left countless comments underneath those uploads correcting the record. Then he stated it as plainly as language allows. He was not Elvis Presley. He had never claimed to be anyone other than himself. There was only one Elvis, and he was not that man. What surprises people most when they finally read the full statement is the gentleness running through it. There is no bitterness in the writing, no wounded pride, and no attacking of the people who had spent years accusing him. He wrote that most people already understood the truth and simply found genuine comfort in the music, and he treated that comfort as something worth protecting rather than mocking. He described Elvis as a man who came from humble beginnings, someone he respected deeply, and he acknowledged that he could hear that influence in his own singing. If Elvis were somehow alive, he added, he would call him a brother in Christ. Through all of it, Joyce simply kept doing what he had always done. He preached every Sunday. He led the music from the piano, often playing and singing at the same time. He performed the gospel numbers that had started the entire storm, refusing to stop singing them just because strangers had turned them into evidence. He held baptisms in a nearby creek when the weather allowed it. He still took nothing for himself. By the time 2020 arrived, the questions had become so relentless that somebody finally decided a written statement was not enough and drove to Benton to knock on the pastor's front door. The knock at the door. The man who made that drive was a YouTuber known online as Spa Guy, and the encounter that followed became one of the most revealing moments in this entire 14-year saga. He tracked Joyce down at home and knocked shortly after the pastor had woken from a midday nap. If the theory had any truth in it, that was the exact moment it should have cracked. A man protecting an enormous secret, caught off guard and unprepared, would have hesitated or stumbled or reached for a script. Joyce did none of those things. He answered immediately and simply, telling the camera that he was not Elvis and that plenty of people asked him that same question. He confirmed his age at the time and noted the obvious difference in years between himself and Elvis Presley, then steered the conversation straight back toward the gospel that mattered to him. That filmed conversation should have closed the case for good. Instead, it did something that must have been genuinely demoralizing to watch. It became raw material for the next round of analysis videos, chopped apart frame by frame, slowed down, and studied for micro-expressions that supposedly revealed the truth behind his words. Creators zoomed in on his eyes. They analyzed his tone. They pointed to the way he shifted his weight in the doorway. Every attempt he made to end the story was absorbed and converted into fresh content for the story itself. That was the trap he had been living inside since 2011, and it explains something important about the years that followed. Inside that church, two completely different versions of the same man were being lived out at the very same time. Two realities under one roof. The people who actually attended services in Benton saw something entirely unremarkable. They saw a steady pastor who had been beside them for years, a husband married to the same woman since 1975, a father to 3 children, and a grandfather several times over, a man ordained back in 1981 who had never once wavered in who he claimed to be. They knew his habits and his moods. They had watched him bury their relatives and baptize their grandchildren. Joyce addressed his own congregation about the situation more than once, and in those moments, he spoke with a directness he rarely offered to cameras. He told them he had been born Bob Joyce and would die Bob Joyce, that he had never been any person other than himself, and that the church was running no scheme or scam of any kind. He reminded them that nobody on staff drew a salary. He described the practical damage honestly, the impersonators stealing his face, the endless stream of messages, and the way this spectacle kept dragging attention away from the actual work of caring for people who needed help. And here lies a detail the conspiracy videos rarely mentioned, because it quietly damaged their narrative. The church was growing for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the legend. The congregation moved from rented space to a building on Salt Creek Road, and later relocated again to a larger converted barn on Samples Road, a facility capable of seating well over 200 people. Services were recorded and uploaded to the official channel every week, and the people watching were not all conspiracy hunters. Many were simply looking for the music and the message. The distance between the documented life and the digital fantasy kept widening year after year, until Joyce finally reached for the one tool that no comparison video could argue with: the truth that was always there. Now comes the part of this story that deserves complete honesty, because the answer was never actually hiding. The age gap alone makes the entire theory impossible from the very beginning. Elvis Presley died in August of 1977, when Bob Joyce was 25 years old and already a married man living his own life in Arkansas. The timeline simply does not fit. When Elvis was becoming one of the most famous people on the planet, Joyce was already an adult living a separate life. There is no secret identity, hidden transformation, or plastic surgery explanation that can erase 17 years from a person's actual age. The documented timeline alone is enough to make the Elvis theory collapse before anything else is even considered. The vocal resemblance, though, is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves respect rather than ridicule. Independent analysts who examined the recordings closely, including channels that specialize in this kind of work, found real similarities in vibrato width and mid-range tone, particularly on the gospel material. Then they reached the same conclusion every single time. These are two different men, two voices shaped by the same region, the same church traditions, and the same era of American gospel music, which is a far more beautiful explanation than any conspiracy. The rest of the so-called evidence falls apart under any real pressure. There are no medical records confirming those matching scars. No named forensic laboratory ever authenticated a voice match. Those precise-sounding percentages traced back to nobody verifiable at all. Careful side-by-side comparisons reveal clear physical differences, including a visible gap between Joyce's front teeth that Elvis never had. Elvis Presley's estate, his family, and every serious biographer who has ever studied his life have given this theory exactly zero credibility. What lingers with me most is not the debunking. It is the loneliness underneath the whole affair. A quiet pastor spent nearly 15 years being told he was somebody else by strangers who had never met him, watched criminals wear his face to rob his admirers, and still refused to speak about any of it with cruelty. When words finally failed him completely, He opened his own biology to the world, rather than let the confusion continue. He had nothing to prove, and he proved it anyway. Then, he walked back to that piano and kept on singing, exactly as he had been doing all along. What do you make of a man who had to hand over his own blood just to be believed by strangers? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I would love to know where you stand on this.